FAO is proud to present Dr. Robert Beach.
Hello, I'm Robert Beach from RTI International, located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina in the U.S. Along with several colleagues, I've been working on assessing the impacts of expanded bioenergy production on markets and net GHG emissions. In this talk, I'll focus on some of our recent work exploring the impacts of increasing the use of biomass for U.S. electricity production. The model that we used for this work is the Forest and Agricultural Sector Optimization Model with Greenhouse Gases, or FASM GHG. This is a model that simulates the U.S. agricultural and forestry sectors, including movements of land and commodities between those sectors. In particular, the commodity movements tracked allows for the substitution of fiber produced from short rotation woody crops, which are in the agricultural component of the model, to be substituted for certain forestry products. The FASM GHG has very detailed greenhouse gas accounting and simulates changes in agricultural and forest product markets, land use, greenhouse gas emissions, and other economic and environmental impacts. The model characterizes U.S. forests at a regional level, with dividing the U.S. into 11 regions, as shown on the slide, 9 of which have forestry production. The Southwest and the Great Plains are assumed to have no significant forestry production and are not modeled. The main focus is on private timberland, but there are also exogenous harvests from public forests that enter the market. One important factor for this study was consideration of potential co-firing of biomass at coal-fired plants. Thus, we developed data on the location of all existing coal-fired plants in the U.S. and their generation in order to distribute that generation across the FASM regions, and in order to calculate transportation costs for biomass, as well as potential, since a lot of the biomass is likely to be co-fired at coal plants. Although the model includes both co-firing at different percentage levels, as shown in the table, 5 through 20% and 5% increments, you can also have dedicated biomass plants that are solely biomass, if that is cost effective and competitive with other, with co-firing. In total, based on data at the time the study was conducted, about 2.1 billion tons of biomass per year would be required to replace all coal, and which is a very large amount. In our scenarios, we looked at biopower production levels at the model baseline level, and then increasing above the base in increments of 25 terawatt hours per year to be reached by 2030, with a linear phase in between 2010 and 2030. And we examined those different increases in biopower production levels for a number of different scenarios, where we varied the feedstock eligibility, as well as the potential for commodity substitution between the agricultural and forest sectors. So our results for changes in average annual greenhouse gas emissions are shown in this table, where the first row in both the short-term and the long-term results that are presented here, where short-term we're looking at just 2010 to 2025, and long-term 2025 through 2040. In both cases, those are showing the emissions that are displaced by using biomass at these levels, 25, 100, and 200 terawatt hours per year in place of coal. So as long as the emissions from a biomass scenario are lower than what they are displacing, there's a net reduction in emissions. And as can be seen in the table, in the short term, all scenarios reduce net emissions except for the residues only case and the case with all forestry sources but no substitution of commodities with ag. In the longer term, the results look a little bit different, with the residues only case actually having a very opposite effect, at least as you get to large demand, 200 terawatt hours per year, where it has very negative effects. So that's one of the very interesting results of this. I mean, there are a lot of dynamics going on. There's commodity substitution, land use is shifting around. Afforestation plays a very large role as the demand for biomass for electricity goes up. In most of the scenarios, there's a considerable amount of afforestation that results in greenhouse gas reductions through sequestration. But one of the interesting results is in our only residues case, where the interactions between land use change, harvest levels, and expectations of future policy impacts actually lead to differing results at higher volumes of electricity production. In the short run, in a 100 terawatt per hour case, tree carbon stocks increase slightly due to a temporal shift in harvest patterns as landowners harvest less than in the other forest biomass scenarios, and they also end up considerably increasing afforestation in anticipation of large harvest levels in the future in order to produce sufficient residues. So this intertemporal shift in management strategies, along with the expanded forest land base, actually ends up increasing emissions in the short term, but reducing them in the long term due to the additional afforestation and the change in forest management over time. Overall, a key conclusion of the study is that assessing the net greenhouse gas impacts of biopower is complex and depends on a number of factors. The results you find will vary by scale, by time, depending how far out into the future you're looking, and by market response, how much market response you include. The fact that it's a dynamic model, an intertemporal model, means that the model is, essentially landowners are looking ahead, anticipating increases in volumes and taking action in the near term in response. In general, we find greenhouse gas emissions associated with biomass feedstock production are less than the greenhouse gases that would have been emitted had the power come from coal combustion. So most of the scenarios examined are resulting in net reductions in greenhouse gas emissions when biopower is used. Scenarios that included agricultural biomass tended to generate fewer emissions than those that relied only on forestry. And one of the reasons for that is that in general, the agricultural feedstocks have higher yields when considered on an annual basis than you see from forests. So as a result, while forest yields could be increased potentially through changes in species composition and silvicultural intensity, given the current assumptions regarding technological improvement, cases with agricultural feedstocks tend to have lower total emissions, though forestry certainly plays a very considerable role. Although, as can be seen in the figures to the right, that role varies over time, in part as you tend to see a scale up of energy crops as you go further out in time in many of the cases, depending on the volume of feedstock that is required. So the purpose of this paper was to investigate the interrelationships between biomass feedstock eligibility and a biopower policy and the level to which adjustments in the flow of land and commodities between agriculture and forestry sectors affect the policy impact. Understanding potential market dynamics is important, but for crafting meaningful energy policy, but not in itself sufficient. So this paper tries to focus on using different modeling approaches and demonstrating some of the important considerations to be taken into place when developing policies around bioenergy. So thank you all for listening, and here's my contact information if anyone would like to get in touch.